Thank you very much. Good evening, gentlemen. Sorry for the delay. We have an action-packed class tonight, God willing. Action-packed, jam-packed with information and good things. We have been speaking about, in our previous classes, Chapter 7 of the Shaar HaYichud of the second part of the Tanya. If you have not noticed, I wish to encourage everyone to review and pay attention with the daily Tanya that we're learning now, because the daily Tanya this time of year is Shaar HaYichud. It's this part of Tanya, always corresponds with Shavuos. And if you weren't here for the class we gave on Shavuos, then you don't know why. But if you want to go and rewatch and review with the class we gave on Shavuos, you find that in the archive, you'll find out why this time of year is when we study this part of the Tanya that we've been studying in this class for many months. Now, here at the end of chapter 7, we are still discussing the idea, really, or the implications of the idea of the non-literal tzimtzum, that the tzimtzum, the initial removal, thank you very much, of God's light from the universe, as the Arizal describes it, is not a removal. It's actually a concealment. He doesn't take any of his light away. He is present everywhere. His presence is here, even in this room right now, and in each and every creation, is God's infinite presence, exactly as it is before the world is created. Rather what? That presence is concealed. That presence is hidden. Why is it hidden? To allow other perspectives, to allow other points of view to arise on what is real, what is reality, what is it that exists. Because as we explained at length, if God's infinite light created the universe and there were no tzimtzum, which is possible, His infinite light can create the universe, but what would the universe be? Everything that would be, everything in that universe that was created without a tzimtzum would feel itself to be not a self. It would feel itself to be merely a pure expression of Hashem. How can you have a universe of selves, of defined beings that exist in and of themselves in their own terms, if they feel constantly only the infinite presence of Hashem, that they express only that infinite presence? Cannot be. So rather, what has to happen? There has to be a concealment of that light, so that even though His infinite presence is here right now, we can feel that there are other things. We can feel the everything that exists here that He creates feels as if it has its own point of view, its own perspective. There are other selves, there are other things that can be said to exist. And we explained that because of the tzimtzum, fundamentally, because of this concealment, we divide God's light. God's expression is divided into two different modes. There's two different types of divine expression due to the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is what shows us, so to speak, that there are two different ways for God to express Himself. There is what's called sevev, the light that surrounds the worlds, and you have the Sevev Kol Almin, to have its full name, surrounding all worlds, and you have Mamale Kol Almin, the light which fills all worlds. But as we explained previously, both of these names are misleading. The light that surrounds is also within, and the light that's within also surrounds, right? That's not really the distinction. That's not really the true distinction. The true distinction is not that one is outside, one is inside. Because the one that is outside is also inside, and the one that's inside is totally one with the one that's outside. In other words, that's not trying to differentiate between these two things in that manner would not be helpful. We wouldn't really get to the core of the issue. But in light of what we said about the tzimtzum and the non-literal concealment, the non-literal removal, right? Rather, the concealment of God's light, of God's infinite presence, we now have a means to distinguish between these two things. And we've been explaining the Alter Rebbe. So far, we've read inside about sevev, the first type. sevev, the surrounding light, is Hashem's infinite light that is everywhere inherently, right? By definition. It's that light which is by definition everywhere. And so therefore it's even in this room and in this table right now. But because of the tzimtzum, because that light is concealed, we do not see or detect that light everywhere. We don't feel that light. We don't feel that presence. That infinite light is hidden, is not understood. It's not understood in our terms, right? In fact, without the tzimtzum, there isn't even our terms on which to understand the light, if you understand what I'm saying. In other words, if there were no tzimtzum, there would be Or HaSevev, and Or HaSevev could create a table, but would there really be such a thing as a table for the light to even exist within? And the answer is no, because whatever you're defining a table as, the entire definition is merely an extension of that light. Those are the only terms in which to define anything before the tzimtzum. After the tzimtzum, we still have Or HaSevev. Hashem's infinite light is still everywhere. That light still exists and is present everywhere, and as we discussed, creates everything from something to nothing, is involved in the creation of the universe. However, there is also a second kind of light. The second kind of light is this light which goes on to be the individual perspectives, the separate selves that are allowed to arise after the tzimtzum. In other words, you have not just God's perspective, you have not just things in Hashem's terms, you have things in their own terms. The infinite light of Hashem is within the table, and the table is something that exists on its own terms. There's something called the table. It has an inherent identity. It is not defined in terms of the infinite. It has its own definition of what it is. And the infinite light of Hashem is within it on its terms. The light of Hashem is there on its own terms. This is called the light of Mamale Kolamin, the light that fills all worlds. Rather than saying fills all worlds, we should understand it as the perspective created by the tzimtzum, that which allows Hashem's light to become separate beings, separate selves, separate perspectives. And as we explained at the beginning of the chapter, it is this separate perspective which goes on to be part of what we call Yehuda Ilah and Yehuda Tata, the higher level unity and the lower level unity. In other words, these separate perspectives are not really separate. On the contrary, they're absolutely one with the light that was before the tzimtzum, right? But they're not the same as the light was before the tzimtzum, right? Here's where you have to start being very careful in distinguishing. You have a light that's before the tzimtzum. Now after the tzimtzum, we call it Or HaSevev, right? That light of Hashem, the infinite presence of Hashem, which is within everything but not on its terms, right? It's within everything simply because it's infinite. It's everywhere only on its own terms, only on Hashem's terms. Then you have a different light, Mamale Kolamen, which fills all worlds, which is now, after the tzimtzum, the light that becomes each and every self, each and every creation on its own terms. Yes? So even though, but that light which becomes each and every individual creation is, in two different ways, absolutely one with the infinite light that precedes it. So in other words, we make a separation, and then we see how the separation is really a form of unity. But there is really a separation. In other words, Mamale and Sevev, it's important to understand the distinction in order to understand how the two things are really one. The reason why that's important is because we normally, in our regular lives, in our perspectives, don't live in a state of the higher level unity and the lower level unity. We don't see how these two things are one. So if I just come up to you and tell you that really the table is just an expression of Hashem's kingship, and Hashem's kingship is absolutely one with the infinite light that precedes the tzimtzum, you're going to tell me, what does that actually have to do with the table as I perceive it, right? Or if I were even more bold, I would say it about you. You are one with the infinite light that's before the tzimtzum, and you would say, but what does that have to do with my day-to-day life, my day-to-day experience? So instead what we do is we acknowledge the day-to-day experience. We say that God creates you as a separate perspective, right? Which is the truth. He creates you as a being. He creates everything around us as a being of mamale, of something that exists as its own self and on its own terms. Now that we understand what this thing is on its own self and its own terms, we can slowly understand how to integrate it back with Sevev, right? Or to put it in slightly different words, you could argue that the Alter Rebbe's whole order here in Tanya is really backwards, right? You could argue. Because he's reaching his conclusion now, and his conclusion is really that Sevev and Mamale are all the same, right? And it's all absolutely unified with Hashem. That's the conclusion, right? All of these things are godly, and they're united with each other even. So why does he take 7 chapters to reach that conclusion? He should tell us at the beginning everything is one with Hashem. And now I'll give you the details, right? Start with the Yichud Sevev Mamale. Say there's these 2 things, I'm going to tell you what they are in a second, but you should know they're absolutely one, right? And then he could enumerate, he could start going down, show how you get from this unity to separate things, for example. But the Alter Rebbe goes in the opposite direction, which is why it can be a little tricky learning Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. The Alter Rebbe starts with our day-to-day perspective, that everything is separate, and he works up, right? So the grand conclusion is that all these things are one. Right? Because in other words, it's vitally important to realize learning Tanya, the classic rookie mistake, studying Chassidus, classic beginner mistake is to leap immediately to the idea that everything is one with Hashem and everything is nothing and it's all just, right? It's all, why do I care about the nature of the wallet or the nature of the table? I know that it's just a mamale, which is unified with the sevev, and there's nothing here. Right? The Alter Rebbe takes the exact opposite perspective, the exact opposite, because that's not real. Right? The Alter Rebbe's whole approach is it has to be real, has to be authentic, has to be bepnimius, right? Just as God creates the table on its own terms, right? Just like he creates something from nothing, and that something exists on its own terms, so when you, considering the unity of Hashem and the avodah that you have to do in this world, are going to return that something to nothing, you're going to come to the table and explain to the table how each, like the famous story of the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab was once davening, and someone asked him what he was thinking about during davening, and he said that he was looking at all the tiles on the floor, and the reason why it took him so long to daven is that he wouldn't leave until each and every single tile he knew was absolutely one with Hashem. Right? He wouldn't leave the room. That's why it took him so long to daven. He wouldn't leave. I believe the story of the Rebbe Rashab, if I'm not mistaken, or one of his Chassidim, but the point still holds that he wouldn't leave the room until he knew that each and every tile on the floor was one with Hashem. Right? So what the Alter Rebbe is telling you is you can't just leap to the conclusion that obviously the tiles are one with Hashem because everything is created from Hashem and everything comes from Hashem. The Alter Rebbe is saying that's not serious. The Rebbe Rashab could do that in 3 seconds. Why are you davening so long, right? You daven so long because each and every creation has its own individual nature, and just as Hashem creates it specifically as its own unique creation, you have to understand how it's one with Hashem in its own unique way. It's not that everything's one with Hashem the same way. Everything is one with Hashem in its own unique way, because everything, as we're going to discuss tonight, has its own individual soul, its own individual source, and you have to understand it in that perspective, right? That's the order the Alter Rebbe teaches in. So now that we understand, even though we know that our conclusion is going to be that Mamale is absolutely one with Sevev, right? We are actually going to we're going to focus in Mamale pretty much for the rest of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. The rest of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah is about Mamale, not about Sevev. We understand that the light which goes on, which is within the world, which is after the Tzimtzum, and makes each and everything its own individual self, we understand that light is really in Yichud Eilah and Yichud Tata one with the light that is before the Tzimtzum, that is truly infinite, the infinite presence of Hashem. We understand that it's just Hashem. It's Hashem everywhere. It's simply a continuation of his infinite expression. Mamale is one with Sevev, right? Alter Rebbe has already told us this. But now that we know that this is the case, right, we are now going not to talk more about Sevev. We're actually going to turn around. So it's like a pyramid almost. We start in chapter 1 with the objects of the physical world. We work all the way up to, in chapter 7, Yichud Sevev Umamale, right? How all of these things are absolutely one with Hashem's infinite light, with Ur HaSevev, and we explain what that is as the light before the Tzimtzum. It's the Tzimtzum that separates, so to speak, or makes an apparent separation between Sevev and Mamale, because it allows everything to have its own perspective, right? Its own self, even though those selves are absolutely one with Sevev and basking within the infinite light of Hashem at every moment and have no separation from it at all, right? And now that we reach that peak, that everything is absolutely one with Hashem, we now come down again. We're now going to, now that we know that fact, we are going to take it and we're going to make it bepnimius. We're going to make it authentic and an inner truth of each and every specific creation, right? We're going to see, basically, we're going... if you're going to say that Sevev and Mamale are one, most of the problems are going to be on the Mamale side, right? If you're going to say that the infinite light of Hashem, which is absolutely one, and the finite world with all of its multiplicity and differences in each and every individual soul are the same thing, right? The issue is how can you say they're the same thing, right? Everything appears to be us, not to be like Sevev, but to be like Mamale, right? So to delve into that, you have to appreciate Mamale more. So here in chapter 7, we take near the end, we're going to start talking about Mamale, and then in one form or another, you're going to see it's in different ways and different things, but that talk is going to continue for chapters. We're going to talk about Mamale. So without further ado, let's turn to page 931. Umamale kol amen, and he fills all worlds, right at the top. Let's read. Umamale kol amen, the light that fills all worlds, right? He's still, if you'll recall from many classes ago, he's still technically touching up. He's still explaining word by word the Zohar that he quoted earlier in the chapter, by the way. Umamale kol amen, bechinas hachayus hamislavesh teichetz hamanivra. The light which fills all worlds is the life force, which is... he translated as internalized, which is a very good translation, is internalized in the essence of each and every creation, right? You could say enclosed or invested, right? The same idea. It's internalized within the essence of each creation, the very self. It's the light of Hashem which becomes the self. Etzem is self. It becomes the self of every creation. Shehi mitzumtzemes b'soiche b'tzimtzum rav. It is contracted within it by great limitations, great tzimtzumim. Kafi erech mahus hanivra, commensurate to the measure of the essence of that creation, the nature of that creation. Shehu bal gvul v'tachlis b'kamusay u'beichusay, because and each and every creation is of limited. Is limited and of limited purpose, both in its quantity and its quality. Dahainu ma'alasai v'chashivusai. What do we mean by its quality? We mean its significance, its level, its importance, right? So the infinite light of Hashem goes to create Mamale, right? You have a tzimtzum. The Ur HaSevev is concealed. Now there's room for there to be other perspectives, for other selves. But to create these other selves, the infinite light of Hashem must be contracted, must be brought down, right? It must be made limited, because each and every individual creation is limited, and the light has to become one with them on their terms. The light has to become one with them in their soul, right? So in other words, if Sevev alone, the light before the Tzimtzum, creates the wallet, right? Sevev creates it at a distance. Let there be a wallet, and there is a wallet, right? There's no need for the light to come down. Because it's Mamale, because he's not creating it as I am God and you are a wallet, but rather the wallet itself, its soul, is an expression of Hashem, which is what his lavshus means. The light of Hashem is internalized in the wallet. It becomes the wallet, right? The soul of the creation it is just the light of Hashem, an expression of Hashem. Therefore, obviously, the expression of Hashem must be contracted and limited and brought down, as the rabbi talks about, like a power transformer, is the rabbi's metaphor all the time, right? Like the power from the factory is too much, it's overwhelming, right? It cannot be, Hashem's infinite light cannot become a wallet. A wallet is an extremely limited and defined thing. Right, in physics, and very physical. It's limited and defined in quantitative. It's quite small, and qualitatively in terms of what it has within it. Right, its significance, its importance, the things it is able to cause, all the powers it has, the quality, the form and the shape and the color. It's limited in all of these things. Right. So to be that limited, the light of Hashem has to be stepped down. It has to be brought lower to become the soul of each and everything. What's his example? Kagain hashemesh. Like, for example, the sun. The body of the sun, in other words, the actual orb of the sun, the thing in the sky, has a finite and limited end, which is approximately 167 times the size of the earth. I should make two notes on this. Number one, why is the Alter Rebbe so specific about the size of the sun? Because the Rambam is so specific. The source comes from the laws of the Rambam, where the Rambam describes the relative size of the sun and the earth. That's the first thing. The second thing to note about the size of the sun, the Alter Rebbe's point is really just that it's limited, and that we know it's limited, and that's the Jewish perspective on the size of the sun, because it's defined in Halakha, right? In other words, he's citing in Judaism, because his metaphor for limited creation is the sun, he's citing the limitation of the sun's size, right? And he gets this limitation from the Rambam. The second thing to note is that the Rebbe's father has a fascinating, a very dense, and actually, for me anyway, quite difficult to understand, I looked it up, a paragraph explaining the Kabbalistic significance of 167 times. If you understood in Kabbalah what the earth was and what the sun was, you understand, he explains there the whole thing, why the sun is 167 times the size of the earth. That's the second point. The third point is that the Rebbe has a rather famous letter where someone wrote him and said that in modern measurements, when you hear scientists talk about the sun versus the earth, they say the sun is millions of times the sun of the earth, the size of the earth. And the Rebbe writes back that there's a simple misunderstanding here, because when most people talk about the comparison and the size, they're talking about volume. When the Rambam is talking about it, he means diameter, 167 times the diameter of the earth, if I'm not mistaken. You can look it up there.
It's in the
volume is the diameter times.
The diameter is just the measure. So in the measure, it's only 167.
One is related to the other. The sun is
obviously, but once you get the exponential measure of volume, right, it becomes millions of times larger, or however many times larger than the earth, as opposed to only 167. And the Rebbe said that anyway, when measuring the diameter of the sun scientifically, it's tricky, because the sun sometimes has extensions, it has various layers and levels, and they expand and contract. So to the Rebbe, if I'm not mistaken, the Rebbe writes, it seems to him the Rambam was simply saying an average. In other words, where in general could you say what's the diameter of the sun in comparison to the earth? Anyway.
And then it's a real number?
Yeah, I believe so.
I mean, like by physics?
Yeah, 167 times around, the diameter. I mean, I'm sure the numbers fluctuate a bit. It depends what you're measuring, right, was the Rebbe's point. In other words, if you're measuring the I forget what they're called, but like the ejections, right? Like sometimes the sun extends further, like a thing comes out of the, you know what I'm talking about? Like from the surface of the sun. Yeah, so sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, various layers. But the bottom line is
modern physics is 110.
But the bottom line is that it's within. It's not a millions versus 167. In other words, it's within. The Rambam is not so crazy. It's a misunderstanding. Anyways, that's just a note here. But what's the main point Alter Rebbe is making? The main point Alter Rebbe is making is that the sun is a limited being. The sun has a limited place. It has a limited measure in Judaism, as we see in Judaism, right? The Alter Rebbe would always rather bring a example from Torah rather than from science, because Torah is forever and science is not. The echusei umalasei. So too, so not just quantitatively in the size of the sun, but in its quality and significance. In other words, in the light of the sun. What's the significance of the sun? Its light, which there's a nice metaphor in there somewhere. If someone wants to look it up, you judge the quality of the sun by its light. What is it able to be pale? What is it able to affect or help others? Right? That's the quality of the sun. There's also a limit how much the sun is able to shine. It does not shine endlessly because it is limited, right? In other words, no matter how bright a light you have, the light does not shine endlessly, right? You can get far enough away that it's not light anymore, right? There's a limitation to the sun's power, right? Nowadays, you could even say, I don't know if the Alter Rebbe meant this, but you could also say the sun is limited in its ability to shine also in time, right? There's a specific amount of fuel in the sun that it's been given, right? It's not an indefinite source of energy. It's finite. Is the Rambam's example? Is the Alter Rebbe's example? V'chein kol hanivraim, continues the Alter Rebbe, so too all of the creations heim balig v'v'tachlis are limited, are finite and limited. Ki me'aretz l'rakia mahalech tav kufshana chulu, because from the earth to the heaven is measured 500 years. A very famous Gemara where it talks about the distances and the measures. Do not ask me what that means. I don't know. It talks about the distance from the earth to the heavens, and then between the heavens there's certain measures and all sorts of interesting things there. You can look up the Gemara. But the bottom line is, what's the main takeaway for us? The main takeaway for us is that limited. These things are not infinite. These things are finite, right? I don't think I would be too presumptuous to say, by the way, that at least under the definition that matters, Chassidus would not say that the universe is of infinite size, by the way. I'm not sure if such a thing even makes sense in Chassidus' perspective. Chassidus would say the universe is of finite size. I don't know how to reconcile that with anything. It's not really my business. But I can tell you that time and space are included in this notion. Time and space are also creations, and they're also both limited creations. Time and space themselves are limited creations. The imkaden, continues Alter Rebbe, and if so, hachayus ha'melaveshes behem, he bechinas tzimtzum rav va'atzum. The life force which is invested within them is greatly and powerfully contracted. It is limited. First, God's infinite expression must be contracted with numerous and powerful contractions or limitations of that divine expression, until there will be created from that power and that light the self of the creations as they are in a limited fashion. In other words like this. If the creation is limited, if the sun, for all of its power and all of its good that it can do and all of the light it can give off, is essentially limited both in size and in quality, then the divine power that is within the sun, the soul of the sun, in other words, the very self of the sun, the divine power which is constantly invested within the sun to give it its very being, right, to give it those limited qualities, that power must also be limited. That power must also be brought down from an infinite state to a finite state. Again, because the Hashem's expression must be in terms of the sun, right? Hashem's expression, if it remained merely infinite, right, then his expression would not need to descend to the level of the sun, right? We would say Hashem could create a sun, let the sun be limited, and Hashem's light is infinite, right? But we're saying these two things actually meet. We are saying that what is the sun, what is the limitation of the sun, that itself is an expression of Hashem. It's the light of Hashem which is making those limitations, that limited creation that is the sun. And if so, that light must be brought down and must be limited, right? And this in general is a common principle in Chassidus. In the study of Chassidus, in the Tzemach Tzedek, the other Rebbeim that follow the Alter Rebbe, it's repeated again and again that each and every creation is limited and has its precise soul that it has. And it's important to realize the creation is limited because the limitation of the creation points to its divine source. Right? Because the creation is limited, therefore, in its eternal seeming aspects, the fact that the creation keeps continuing, it's reliant on God. Yes? Or to put it in to put it slightly differently, it's a bit of an aside, but hopefully an interesting one. The Tzemach Tzedek argues, philosophically speaking, that generally speaking, it is the fact that each and every creation is finite and limited that demonstrates that everything must be created something from nothing. It is the fact that everything is finite and limited that demonstrates that they must be created something from nothing. Right, for the very simple reason, and the truth is not very simple at all. It's actually very complicated, and the Tzemach Tzedek talks about it at length, and it's not the easiest. It's not easy reading, but the argument boils down to the idea that if a finite being actually is to exist forever, that being which exists forever must be able to contain within it, so to speak, an infinite power or an infinite energy that allows it to exist forever. And it's not as abstract as I'm making it say. The summary is more abstract than the details. In other words, the summary is more abstract than the details. The Tzemach Tzedek explains how this works, what it means that for something to exist forever, it requires an infinite self-contained energy, so to speak. So the fact that things are not infinite, right, points towards Hashem. In other words, it's an important, for the study of Chassidus, it's an important fact of the world. It's something you can actually think about, how because this thing is finite, it therefore does not have the capacity to persist forever. It must be dependent on something infinite. Now, the truth is that the Tzemach Tzedek himself mentions, and as is very famous to those who study such things, that the Rambam very famously, in his Moreh Nevuchim, in the Rambam's philosophy, he famously says this is not the case. This is not a good argument. The Rambam actually says, very famously in the Guide for the Perplexed, that the world could be either infinitely old or created, philosophically speaking. In other words, if you're working from just the intellect of man, if you don't have a Torah which tells you the truth, you could conclude equally well that the world is infinitely old, or that the world was created, in other words, so to speak, at a certain point in time, that the world has a finite age. And the Rambam goes on to explain how he thinks that the world being created makes more sense, but really, you have to rely on the Torah and on God's revelation to conclude that the world was created. He reasoned that you couldn't figure this out philosophically. The Tzemach Tzedek actually disagrees. The Tzemach Tzedek says, even philosophically, you can understand how the world, and many other Jewish philosophers, his disagreement is based on the earlier works of Rav Saadia Gaon and other famous Jewish philosophical works, but the Tzemach Tzedek argues that from the finite nature of things, because things are finite, you know they cannot be infinite. And by the way, I should just point out that the Rambam says that this takes away nothing from the necessity for Hashem. In other words, the Rambam's argument, which this is a thing that people today don't understand, something that a lot of people in their common sense view, which common sense and philosophy do not often sometimes go in different directions, right? But the philosophers are usually right because they've actually spent more than 5 minutes thinking about it, which is difficult. But the Rambam says that it actually, Zelo Meshaneh, doesn't make a difference to God's presence in the world or God's necessity for the world, whether the world is infinitely old or the world is new. The Rambam says, even if the world is infinitely old, the only way that it can be infinitely old is by dependence on Hashem, a dependence on something that is eternal. In other words, in the details, in the idea that any physical being of limited size and quality can actually persist infinitely, the Rambam and the Tzemach Tzedek actually agree. The Rambam agrees that the universe on its own can't be infinitely old. He simply says that with God, the universe could be either created or infinitely old. And then he says, you need the Torah to tell you that it's not infinitely old, that it's created. The Tzemach Tzedek disagrees. He says, no, even with Hashem, the universe itself cannot be infinitely old. It must have a time it must have a limited time that you can go back to when it was created. But everybody agrees that the universe depends on Hashem.
What's his argument?
On what?
Tzemach Tzedek, that it had to be created.
It's complicated. I can't get into now.
We have the counting of the years.
Yeah. So
No,
what?
this is because of the
No,
Torah.
but that's because of the Torah.
Philosophically.
He's saying philosophically. He's saying if you don't believe the Torah is true, for example, God forbid, and you were trying to figure out the nature of the universe on your own, the Rambam says, even though you must conclude that there is a God on which the universe depends at every moment, there's no disagreement there. Every logical thinking person, the Rambam says, will conclude that the universe requires a God and it depends on God for its existence at every moment. You may not conclude that this universe had a beginning. Maybe the universe is as old as God is, so to speak. Right? The universe has always been here. There's always been some sort of matter or something that exists. Because the Rambam really in this follows after Aristotle, which is ancient Greek view, but the Rambam doesn't conclude that way. He's just saying you could intellectually understand it that way equally as well. Because we have the Torah, which tells us the world was created, we know it was created. The Tzemach Tzedek disagrees. He says that you don't even need to get to the Torah to know the world is created. He sides with other philosophers who say that no, even with just the human mind, you can conclude not just that the world depends on God, but that the world was created at a certain point in history. It's not infinitely old, right? And by the way, the whole ascendance of the triumph in recent history of the Big Bang Theory is fascinating because almost the scientists have, at least superficially, at least on the surface level, come to agree that the universe had a beginning, which people nowadays don't even realize how much of an innovation and a chiddush that was, because from Aristotle until however long, 100 years ago, all natural philosophers and all scientists thought that the world was infinitely old, which is how the Tzemach Tzedek came to be arguing with people to tell them that it's not infinitely old in the first place. Right? That's how that whole conversation came about, because he was arguing with the scientists of his day, the philosophers of his day, trying to explain to them that the world is not infinitely old, which was the monolithic view of science until relatively recently in history. So yet another area where science is slowly, in its own way, and very slowly, becoming aligned with the view of Torah, which says that the world was created. Okay, we went very far afield. Let us go back.
Now, is that relative?
Is what relative?
General information.
What do you mean?
Well, you said the Earth could have gone back,
Yeah.
Infinitely.
Yes.
Now you have relative measurements in infinite, so you could have.
What do you mean?
Well, the Earth could be, let's say, a factor of 1, but the existence of the universe, for example, could be a factor of 100.
Saying the universe could be much older than the Earth itself, right?
Yeah, or
Right.
that type of example.
The truth is that I'm not sure if I think that these arguments would account for that, because their standards for what limitation is are very, very, very broad. In other words, they would tell you that anything that has extension in space that exists within time is limited in this way, and it couldn't have existed forever. So even if, it doesn't matter what universe you conceive of, any universe you can see, basically any possible universe, so to speak, under the laws of logic and the laws of physics, would be a finite universe according to the Tzemach Tzedek, if his arguments hold. In other words, it doesn't matter, it's not that he needs the earth or a wallet, he's saying that anything which is a body, basically, and in the broadest sense of what a body means, anything that is a body must have only existed for a finite amount of time. And we could do a whole class, and probably many classes on this idea, different time, God willing. Let's continue with the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe is saying that the existence of each and every finite being shows us, what does it point to? That the light of Hashem from Amalei Kolaman, the light which becomes and is internalized into, becomes the soul and the truth and the essence of those limited beings, that light must therefore undergo tzimtzumim. It must be contracted. It must be limited. Because, as the Alter Rebbe says at the bottom of page 932, because the light must first undergo numerous and powerful contractions until created beings, by the nature finite and limited, may be brought into existence from its power and its light. Let's continue. Kimakar continues the Alter Rebbe, page 933, top of the page. Because the source of the life of each and everything comes from the breath of Hashem's mouth, which is invested within the 10 utterances by which the world is created that it talks about in the Torah. As you may have noticed, we have now made it back full circle, back to chapter 1, right? This is what we started talking about in this part of Tanya. The 10 utterances by which the world is created. The first thing we spoke about is that when God says, Yahira kiel, let there be a firmament, right? Those words stand constantly in the firmament and are creating it. That's how this whole journey got started. That was the first step. So now we are back to talking about them, right? We're back from the top, and now we're going back down to each and every creation. And what is the source of life of each creation? The breath of Hashem's mouth invested in it. The 10 utterances which create them. And the breath of his mouth could have extended infinitely, without end or without limit. And to create infinite worlds, both in quantity and in quality, and to give them life forever. In other words, the source of the world is from Hashem's mouth, from Hashem's breath. He speaks them into existence, and when Hashem wants to speak, he speaks infinitely. In other words, this is a subtle point that we're going to unpack, God willing, over many coming classes. It's going to be a running theme in the next chapters of the Tanya. But it's not just the Ur HaSevev, which is infinite. It's also the higher levels of the Ur HaMamale, which is infinite. It's not just the light which is before the Tzimtzum, which is infinite. The source of the worlds itself is also infinite. And the truth is that this is information that you have already, just in different words. What we're saying now is that the breath of Hashem's mouth is infinite, right? And therefore must be contracted to create finite creations, must be limited and brought down to the level of each finite creation. We said this earlier in the same chapter when we said that Malchus, Hashem's kingship, is absolutely united with the higher spheres, with the higher light, right? Yichud Ilah, Yichud Tata, the higher level unity and the lower level unity. In other words, the source of the world is absolutely one with Hashem's infinite light. We spoke about it earlier in the chapter. It's absolutely one with the infinite light of Hashem. That's the source of the world, right? So how do you get from that source to the finite beings we see around us right now? Only by the light being contracted, only through tzimtzumim. Therefore, so we should note, by the way, this is a good time to note, that there are other tzimtzumim in addition to the one we're talking about. There are other contractions of Hashem's light, as should now be obvious, than the one we've been talking about all along. In Chassidus, these are distinguished by different names. What we've been talking about as the tzimtzum, the initial concealment of Ur HaSevev, right? The initial concealment of Hashem's infinite self-expression, that is called in Chassidus tzimtzum harishon. The first tzimtzum, the primordial tzimtzum, it's different than all the other tzimtzums. This contraction, as Ronnie has pointed out, complained really, is really a removal of the light and not a contraction of it, really. It's a total break with the light that was there before. It is totally concealed. So it's hard to understand why it's a contraction, right? Like a limitation, a decreasing of the light, when the light is totally cut off and concealed, right? But nevertheless, this is called the tzimtzum, and the first tzimtzum, the tzimtzum harishon. After that, there are in fact an infinite number of other tzimtzumim. Each level and each world is created through a further tzimtzum, a further limitation and decreasing of Hashem's light. But derech klal, generally speaking, these further tzimtzumim, after the first ones, are only decreasing amounts of light. They are not complete breaks with the light that was there before. So there's sorry? Say again?
That doesn't follow what we've been talking about.
Why?
Because now you're saying it breaks that law, it's not infinite. One of the principles is that, God's light is infinite, so it doesn't get weaker.
No, God's light is infinite, and God's light is everywhere, right? It's even in the place of the creation. God's light is within this wallet. Yeah, but the thing is, no, it is what I just said. Because the way God's light is infinite, there's multiple ways in which God's light is infinite. So God's light is actually so infinite, right, that it doesn't come down to be in terms of this wallet. That's why there's a tzimtzum. In other words, in order for there to be a wallet's a bad example. In order for me to exist as my own independent self, let's make it clearer. In order for me to exist as my own independent self, with my own perspective, that I exist as a self, as my own self-contained being, rather than merely a ray of Hashem's light, that infinite light is so infinite that it actually cannot be me at the same time, right? It is so high and it is so lofty, right, that in that state, before the tzimtzum, it cannot be me at the same time. What does the tzimtzum do? The tzimtzum allows that light to also become me. The tzimtzum allows that light to also become me. So is it less infinite with a tzimtzum that it's cut off, or is it more infinite? And the answer is it's revealing the true infinity of Hashem's light. Right? This is what's called Yichud Elah and Yichud Tata. That the finite constraints of the world, of the self, the fact that this wallet is only a few inches by a few inches and is a certain color and a certain shape and has a certain nature, all of that is really just an expression of that infinite light. The difference is that without a tzimtzum, that light couldn't also be a wallet on a wallet's terms. Right? It couldn't be a wallet. It could create a wallet, but it couldn't be a wallet. Because there is no being anything other than Hashem. That's what the infinite light of Hashem means. In order to be a wallet, there must be a tzimtzum. So the tzimtzum adds to his infinity. It expresses the infinity rather than contradicts it. When we say Hashem's infinite light is concealed, what we mean is that his infinite light is now able in a totally new form, which is why we call it a break, because there's no way to get really from A to B. One has to be totally concealed. You can't get from one to the other in a piecewise process. But his infinite light, through being totally concealed, then returns. It's the same light, says the Arizal. The Arizal is careful to emphasize. The same light returns after the tzimtzum and becomes the soul of each and everything. So it's more of an infinite. It's more of an infinitude. The light reaches and becomes the wallet. The tzimtzum is not a contradiction to his infinitude. It allows his infinitude to be revealed even in the lowest place. Although a good point. It's a famous question in the later Maimarim, like the Maimarim of the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab often explains this point, how the Mamale is really adding to the infinite, or expressing the infinitude of the Sevev in a different way. Right? This is just a further, and that's how you can say that they're totally one. Because they're not just one in that the Mamale happens to be nothing compared to Sevev. They're one because even the Mamale in its purpose and what it does is really just an expression of Sevev. Mamale, we've spoken about this in a previous class, I can't remember when. We have spoken about this point, about how it's really just the same thing, right? Anyway, so there are other tzimtzumim, the light, not just the original tzimtzum, but after that, the light has to come down in infinite tzimtzumim to become the soul of each and everything. And if his light was never contracted, what would happen? Says Alter Rebbe, "V'loi haya nivra elam hazeh klal," this world would never have been created. Right? If the light didn't then come down after we're talking about after the original tzimtzum, right? If the source of the world, in other words, the divine traits, really we're talking about the spheres of Atzilus, very generally speaking. We're talking about the infinite divine traits in the highest of the spiritual worlds, which is the source of the universe as we know it, the limited universe. If that source were not brought down and it's self-limited, we could never have limited creations. Let's see if I covered everything here. Yeah. Yeah, let's read the parentheses. Bottom of page 933. Shekamei shakadosh baruch hu nikra ein sof, just as the Holy One, blessed be He, is called the Infinite One. Kol kach kol midosav upulesav, so too all of His traits and all of His actions. De'iu v'garmu ichad, because He and His attributes are one. We'll have much more on this in the coming chapters. He and His attributes are absolutely one. In other words, one of His attributes, which is attributes of kingship, as we've been calling it, or in some places you would say His attribute of gvura, His attribute of self-discipline and self-restraint, as we mentioned earlier in an earlier chapter, back in chapter 4, and then in chapter 6. Whatever the trait of Hashem is, that is the source for the world, the source for finitude, limitation, right? The actual, the constraints of time and space. The source for that is itself infinite, right? It's not just that He's infinite as He is beyond being a source for the world. Ur HaSevev is Hashem as He's beyond being a source for the world, really, right? The truth is that this too, there's many subtleties, not so simple. You could say Sevev is also a source for the world in one sense. We're not getting into that. I'm just put that aside as a footnote. This is more complicated than I'm letting on, as are most things. But the Ur HaSevev is not a source for the universe. Is not a source for physical creations, for limited, finite creations of time and space. That's Hashem's infinite light, right? It's only the tzimtzum, it's only the concealment of that infinite expression that allows things to arise which exist on their own terms. So we are now talking not about what's before the tzimtzum, we are talking about infinite memale. We're talking about the source of the worlds after the tzimtzum. The first light of Hashem, which is still purely expressing Hashem, which goes on to become the worlds in each and every creation, that light is itself infinite, which is important because it's that infinite light which bridges the gap between the finite world and the Ur HaSevev which exists before the Tzimtzum, right? I always tell you, Atzilus is where the rubber hits the road, right? This place of God's midas, of His traits that we're discussing now, like Hashem's mouth, all these different metaphors for Hashem's traits, for the 10 spheres of Atzilus, they are where the two sides meet, right? So this is vitally important. It's vitally important to realize that it's not just Sevev, which is infinite and cannot be any particular creation. Even His traits in Atzilus, even Hashem's mouth, the source for the worlds, even that is infinite. And that's important because it's the bridge. Atzilus is both. It's finite and infinite. And that's what forms the bridge. That's what lets you say that this is really just has its source in Hashem's mouth. And Hashem's mouth is absolutely one with the infinite light of Hashem before the Tzimtzum. Right? How do you get from something finite to the infinite light of Hashem before the Tzimtzum? There's a middle step where there's something that's both finite and infinite, which is called Atzilus, the meeting of finite and infinite. And without understanding Atzilus, generally, what Atzilus is, you can't understand how this whole picture comes together. It's the middle step. So what he's saying in the parentheses here is very important, and that's why we're going to discuss it in later chapters as well. This whole idea that Hashem has traits. These are defined traits. They have a certain form of limitation and finitude, but they are also totally infinite and require many tzimtzumim to become creations.
The root of Atzilut, the word Atzilut means both.
Correct. Very good.
Both what?
It means Atzilus means Etzel v'Samuch. Yeah, Atzilus means both Etzel v'Samuch, close to Hashem, by Hashem. It also means Netzal, separated off, like a ray separated off from Hashem. So it has both aspects. So just as God is infinite, so too are He and His attributes and His actions. Tahainu, last line on 933. Dahainu achayas hanimshach memidosav, the life which is drawn from His traits. Shein chesed v'rachim v'shar midosav v'kadoshas, like His kindness and His compassion and His other holy divine traits. Ayidei His lavshusan shemizlavshes beruach piv, that they are invested and internalized in the breath of His mouth. Kiu Amar Vayehi, He spoke and the world came into being. The Elam al Yidei Chesed Yibana, and the world is built on and founded on Chesed. B'dvar Avaya Ruach Piv, in the words of Hashem and the breath of His mouth, Shenaisa Kli v'Levush l'Chesed Zeh, which becomes a vessel to this kindness, to His Chesed. Kaden comes to the levushe minei ubei, like the snail whose garment, whose shell is part of its body. right? This is actually referring back to earlier points which we made in chapters 4, 5, and 6 about what? That's how he translates it here. Yeah, some kind of like a turtle or a sea creature, something with a shell that's part of its body. I don't know the exact. I'm not a linguist. In Aramaic, at least, but the point he's making here is the same point that we've made, but earlier in chapters 4, 5, and 6, which actually in all my summaries have really been the missing prakim. So we'll have to go back and recall more about what's in those prakim. But if you'll recall, very generally, those prakim talked about chesed and gvura, havaya and elokim. Right, that remember the tzimtzum is not separate from the light. The tzimtzum and the light in Hashem's words come together as only one expression. Right, that's like the snail with its shell. That what he's saying is that the words of Hashem really isn't only from the divine trait of Malchus / Gvura / Tzimtzum, it's also from the divine trait of Chesed and Revelation, and that these two things come as one, which is something which is very, very short, is what we learned in chapters 4, 5, and 6. So he's saying, but what's the point? The main point he's making here is that both his chesed and his gvura, as we spoke about at length in chapters 4, 5, and 6, both of them are totally infinite, right? So how do you get from a chesed gvura amalgam or a chesed malchus amalgam of his traits, of a mixture of his traits in Atzilus, which is totally infinite, to the actual finite creations of the world? It's through various tzimtzumim, right? Ella. Shetzimtzem Ella, so let's read bottom of page 934. Ella Shetzimtzem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ervachai Shichulis Pashim Ruach Piv. God contracted the light and the life force so that it would be able to extend from the breath of His mouth. Page 935 at the top. Vilbishu Teich Tzirufei Esia Shalsar Memaris V'Tzirufei Tzirufeyan, and He enclosed them within the exchanged letters of the 10 utterances and the exchanges of their exchanges. Right, the anagrams and the anagrams of their anagrams. B'Chilufei V'Tzmurasei Atzman, and with the exchanging and transpositions of the letters themselves, and also through their numbers and their number values. All of this we said already back in chapter 1. We're repeating it now in a new light. That each and every transposition of the letters of the 10 utterances indicates a descent of the life force, right? As we explained in the first chapter at length, not all creations, most creations are not mentioned in the 10 utterances. God says, let there be this, let there be that. He never says the vast majority of things. So where does the individual life force of each and everything come from? It comes through the implicit words that are in those 10 utterances, in the exchanging of the letters, switching the places of the letters, exchanging the letters through different letter exchange systems, and through the comparisons between numbers, different numbers of things. And each one of these exchanges, the further you get from the original 10 utterances, the lower and more limited the light is, the divine expression is. So these are the tzimtzumim. This is how you get, this is the process by which you go from the infinite source of the worlds down to each and every individual creation. Right? Which is a process that you could say takes place. That's why there's not just Atzilus and then the physical world. It's Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. There's many other worlds, many different levels, many different things that this message comes down through and becomes more and more limited and more finite until it becomes the soul of each and every creation. Dahainu. Meaning, what does it mean that the energy comes down? It is able to create and give life to creations. It gives life to creatures whose quality and significance is lower than those who are mentioned in the 10 utterances themselves. Right? As you get further from the 10 utterances which create the world, you get to lower and lower and more limited creations. In those 10 utterances are enclosed God, so to speak, in his glory, God Himself, which are in His attributes. Right, the actual 10 spheres are invested in the 10 utterances which create the world. In other words, there's more of an infinite expression in the 10 utterances themselves than in the more limited letter exchanges and number exchanges that you get from the 10 utterances. And using the mathematical, the transposition to when you take the letters and make them into numbers, this shows on the decreasing of the light and the life force, miut achar miut, a decrease after a decrease. Ad shaloi nishar mimenu b'chinas achrona, until you only have the very lowest amount of light, the very slightest glimmer of light, sheb'chinas hacheshben or mispar, which is math and numbers, kama minei keichos u'madregas klulos be'er v'chai zeh, which is the numbers, which are the different types of life force that are in this light and this particular level, which are invested in this particular form of this particular word. In other words, the Alter Rebbe is adding that when you turn it into numbers, that's the lowest possible distance from the actual thing, because numbers are really only quantitative, right? Numbers are the same among everything. Numbers are cheap, right? They're not qualitative, right? If this thing gets its quality from the shape of the aleph and the way that the aleph is and what the aleph means, that's very meaningful, right? That shows a deep connection to its name. Right?
Character.
Yeah, a character, a quality, a soul that comes from its name. But if it only gets if it's only connected to the aleph, because aleph is one, and this thing also has a value of one in its total gematria, right? That's a very tenuous relationship, is what he's saying. Let's turn over my page here quickly. The Alter Rebbe is adding parenthetically, after all of these contractions and the like, kasher gazra chachmasa yisbarech, as God's wisdom has commanded, then God's life force is able actually to invest itself within the lowest worlds. By the way, what does the Alter Rebbe basically say straight out here? He says that what is it that intercedes between the lowest levels in godliness and the actual world itself is mathematics. It's interesting, no? Numbers are the lowest point of interface. Once you get to the very lowest expression of godliness, right, then the actual world begins. So the highest thing in the world, maybe you could say, perhaps, mathematics, and the lowest thing in godliness is also the numbers behind, underlying the nature of things. Interesting. So, you have numbers there at that point, yeah. Something to note, that was my own idea, by the way, not gotten from anywhere else. It is only then that the godly life force is able to invest itself within stones and dust which are inanimate. Ki even, for a stone, derech mashal, for example, shma meira, what does its name indicate? He's saying, what's the source of a stone? The stone was our example in chapter 1 as well. Here he's going into a little more detail. Shema Meira Kisharsha Mishem Ha'ila Ban B'Mispare. The source, the name Evan is Aleph Beis Nun. What is the source of Evan? It's in the divine name Ban. There's a Shem Ban. There's a certain name of Hashem called the Shem Ban. And Evan, the two letters of Evan are Ban. The two last letters are Beis Nun. The Eid Aleph, and continues Alter Rebbe, and there's another Aleph, Nesefetz Mishem Acher. Yeah. Latam hayadua liyetzra. To those, there's another aleph added to the ban to make Evan for the reason known to the one who created it, which is an interesting language of the Alter Rebbe. First of all, the Sifrei Kabbalah talk about this at great length, so it's not that no one knows. It seems that the Alter Rebbe doesn't say why here, because there's a machlekes among the Mekubalim where exactly this aleph comes from and what the significance of the aleph is. In the Kutei Torah, the other works of Alter Rebbe, he goes into explaining this. It's a whole thing in Kabbalah. There's the one type of Evan, there's a different type of Evan, stones is a whole thing, right?
Evan is Abba ben Nechet, no? What is it?
Ab ben Nechet, I don't know.
Yeah, some of it's
Not familiar. He's saying here that the Ben comes from Shem Ban and the Aleph comes from elsewhere. So what's he saying, right? Shem Ban, right? There's okay. Let's take a very quick. I know we're over time already. I apologize, and let's try not to make this a habit. But we did start late, so it's my excuse. There's the Shem Havaya, the four-letter name of Hashem, has generally speaking four different. Partsufim, four different ways that the name of Hashem presents. They're called Shem Ma, Shem Ban, Shem Sag, and Shem Ab. And each of these names is simply a numerical, it's a gematria, right? Shem Ma is 45, Shem Ban is 52, Shem Sag is 63, and Shem Av is 72. Right? And the way you get these different numbers is according to what's called the milui, is the filling of Shem Havaya, because you have the letters Yud, Hey, Vav, and then you have the Hey. But there's different ways. What if you actually spelled out the words of those letters? In other words, Yud is itself a word. You spell Yud, Yud Vav Dalet, right? But the truth is, there's actually 4 different ways to spell those letters because the vowels in Hebrew are interchangeable. So you have an Aleph could be a vowel, a Vav could be a vowel, a Hey could be a vowel, and a Yud could be a vowel. Right? So you have 4 different letters that can be vowels. So when you fill the letters, when you spell, so you could spell it, you could spell a hey, the word hey. You could spell as hey aleph, hey yud, hey, right? So there's all different ways to spell the actual words of those letters, and the gematrias of the names, using those 4 different filling letters, are these numbers. You have 45, 52, 63, and 72, right? So these are the 4 different parts of Hashem's name. Chassidus speaks at great length. It's a whole world. Kabbalah, very, very interesting. All different sorts of things. Different souls come from different levels. Different levels represent different things. Anyway, so that's Shem Ban. You have the name which corresponds to 52, which is a very high level of godliness. These are different arrangements of Hashem's name itself, right? Very high levels of godliness. But he's saying, what's the relationship of the stone to godliness? It's in numbers. Right? Shem Ban. It's only by Hashem's name coming into a gematria that it's able to create something as inanimate as a stone. Right? It's not connected to Hashem's name qualitatively in echus, as we would say in Hebrew, but only in kamus quantitatively. If you take a gematria of Hashem's name, that gematria is able to relate to a stone, something as lowly and dead, so to speak, as a stone.
But that gematria, the source of the gematria are actually the letters themselves.
What do you mean?
Aleph is 1, and it's not like 1 is Aleph.
But the thing is, okay, good point. Remember that till 3 minutes from now. 1 second. So I just want to finish the chapter, and then we can discuss that. The Eid Aleph, okay, V'hinei, it's 2 lines from the bottom of 936. V'hinei Shem Ban Ba'atzmai Ba'ilmas Oyenim Eid. The name Ban is in very high worlds. It's the name of Hashem. It's only through many contractions from level to level. Yared Mimenu Chayas Mu'etas B'Me'ed. This is the godly life force descend very, very low. Until it is able to invest and become the soul of his stone. This is the life force of the stone, which gives life to it and brings it into existence at every moment. The Kamesha Katz of the Ilaz is written as we spoke about before in chapter 1. And all of this is Mamale Kolalmen, the light of Hashem, which becomes the soul of each and everything. As opposed to Sevev Kolalmen, as opposed to the life of Hashem, which could never become the low level to become the soul of a stone, right? The stone is the perfect example because you can barely think of anything else that is just purely defined as an extension in time and space as a stone. There's nothing else to say about it. It's just matter taking up space. There's nothing there. It doesn't vary really. There's nothing. It's just a thing that takes up time and space. It's the most time and spacey thing just about that you can think of that exists in the world. And what are we saying? We're saying that it is Mamale that consists, it is this light of Hashem called Mamale, the light which fills the world, that is time and space, that is the life force of time and space. And as we said before, that Mamale, this Mamale after the Tzimtzum, which can come so low to be the absolute nadir, the lowest expression of time and space, that Mamale is itself sourced in Hashem's traits, which are infinite, and they are united with Shevev Kolalmen, right? So to the lowest level, we've just brought it. We brought it all the way down into the lowest point of time and space, and this too is the light of Hashem. And remember, it's the same light that's split into 2 by the Tzimtzum, and the split is not real. Mamale and Shevev are really one. These lights are really the same thing. And he just finishes the chapter here. He says, that each and every level created by these various tzimtzumim and the light coming down to lower and lower levels is able to create creations according to its level, infinitely, both in quantity and quality, giving them everlasting life. In other words, this light of Hashem, which comes down to be a stone, is able, even though it's limited to its level, to only being a stone and not being something greater, not being a giraffe. It can only be a stone, it can't be a giraffe. But because it is an infinite expression of Hashem, and more on all of this to come, because it is still an expression of Hashem, it's still the light, it's still Elokus, it's still Mamale Kolamin, the light of Hashem which fills the worlds, it has the power to create an infinite number and variety of stones. Right? In other words, what he's saying is, at the end of the chapter is there's still something of the infinite to this power. Even though it's limited to being a stone, because it's still godly, it could really be the life source for an infinite number of stones and infinite sizes, shapes, right? All stones, right? The quality is limited, but still in an infinite sense and variety it could still create. Because it's still a power of Hashem, which is emanated from the breath of his mouth, and there is no restraint to his abilities. It's simply that the quality of these levels of godliness is not so great. It's not so great as those creations which are able to be created from the 10 utterances themselves. In other words, which is also going to be important to our general picture, he's saying that even though you have to switch and get away from and mathematize these 10 utterances which create the world so you can get to these very low levels, it's still an extension of the original utterances. It still has something of that infinite power within it. Don't make the mistake and think that these lowly utterances become separate from godliness, God forbid. On the contrary, they themselves are infinite in their own way. It's a limited infinity. But they themselves also have an infinite power. What was your point that you said before, Eyal? Remind me.
The letters, because the source is the letters, not the numbers. Numbers are coming as to explain the letters, and not
right.
the way around.
And you were saying that the Shem Havaya itself, it's the gematria of the name, right? So the thing is, basically, the short answer is that we are decisively saying that the quality and the oifen of the otiyot of Shem Havaya are higher than and not fully captured than the actual milui of the Shem. Right? In other words, it's a bit counterintuitive. You think that if you take the letter Yud and you write it out as 3 letters instead, as Yud Vav Daled, for example, right? That I have more letters, right? In a sense, I'm going up, right? The Alter Rebbe and what Kabbalah would tell you is actually you're going down. There is something about Yud, the letter itself, that cannot be captured by the Milui. The Milui is lower. You're expanding what's within the name, but in the expansion you lose something. There's a certain, there's a certain integrity to the whole. There's something that you have by just the single letter in its quality that you don't get by spelling it out explicitly, right?
The letter Hey waters it down.
Yeah.
But the question was a little bit different because,
yeah.
We talked about that numbers are actually, almost like, they're more important thing than the letters themselves. Even though Gematria actually puts letters into the value of them, the description of the letters, and not the other way around. What is Gematria? You take the letter Aleph, you say, okay, Aleph equals 1, Bet is 2, and so on. It's not like 2 is Bet. It's, the source is the letters.
Correct.
The letters.
Correct.
So why we are saying that, the higher level is like the numbers?
No, we're not. We're not. The numbers you only have to get to at the lower levels. No. We're not saying that. The letters are higher than the numbers. The letters is a very, very deep topic in Chassidus. Letters very deep. Letters go all the way up. Because light, right, which you could compare to the meaning of the letters, right? The meaning of the letters you can decrease and make lower and lower and lower, right? So that what once meant the entire universe now means only the wallet, right? And the way you get away from, the way you get lower and lower meanings is by putting it in more and more words, right? Kind of like how the Wikipedia entry on tigers doesn't convey the tiger as much as the famous poem about tigers. You don't know poems in English, probably. Anyway, William Blake, it's a good one. Anyway, the bottom line is the same way that a poem, the less letters, right, sometimes captures, the shorter, the terser, with more connotations rather than saying things explicitly, can sometimes get at the convey the truth of the thing in a much deeper way, right? Sometimes more is less when it comes to expression, right? So the So the meaning of the words, right, comes lower because you use more and more vessels. You use more words to express it, and what that does is that brings the meaning down into more and more details, and so to speak, splits it up, kind of like the letter Yud becoming 3 letters, right? Yeah, it dilutes it in a sense. Good word. So that's all in the meaning that the letters convey is really what we're talking about. But what if you ask the question, what about the letters themselves, right? Because then you have a problem of recursion, right? I say that the letter Yud itself is higher than the letters Yud, Vav, Daled. But Yud, Vav, Daled has a Yud, right? It itself has a Yud, right? So now where does this Yud come? In other words, where do the letters themselves come from? Right? What's the source of the letters? And that's very, very deep. Chassidus talks in a very, very lofty concept. The letters come from all the way up. You can trace the letters from Evan, from the stone, all the way up to Hashem himself. And in fact, they're not affected by the tzimtzum. This is how you get to the idea that the vessels are higher than the light, right? The concealment of Hashem is in some sense even greater than the revelation of Hashem. All these things, right? It's all about the letters. The letters are the same letters because you can't be metzamtzem a letter itself. The Yud is always a Yud. You can't make a Yud. A Yud is a Yud. You can't do anything with it. You can't, right?
Letters are the source of everything. So
the letters are the vessels, and the vessels come as opposed to the light, and the vessels come from very, very, very high. So the letters are much higher than numbers. The bottom line is the letters come from Hashem himself almost. All right. Have a good